Before we delve into the twisted corridors of this true story, please show your support by subscribing to the channel. These narratives continue to live on because people like you choose to listen to the end. And write in the comments, where are you watching from right now? Distance may seem safe, but some stories transcend any border. The Winchester mansion emerged from the morning mist like a living organism refusing to die. Its irregular towers, staircases leading nowhere, and windows opening onto interior walls were not the result of architectural eccentricity, but of a continuous and obsessive process spanning decades. In San Jose, California, the mansion stood out not only for its size, but for the persistent feeling of displacement it caused in anyone who dared to linger too long inside. Daniel Hargreave parked his rental car in front of the rusty gate and slowly turned off the engine. An investigative journalist, accustomed to covering financial fraud and corporate scandals, he didn't believe in ghosts, curses, or supernatural forces. For him, everything always came down to money, guilt, and human decisions taken to extremes. The story of the Winchester fortune, however, insisted on defying this simple logic. Direct heiress to the Winchester arms empire, Sarah Winchester had become one of the wealthiest women in the United States at the end of the 19th century. Millions of dollars came from the mass production of rifles that had survived wars, massacres, and civil conflicts. After the death of her husband and newborn daughter, Sarah left the East Coast and settled in California, where she built continuously for almost 40 years. Workers toiled day and night. Hammers never stopped. There was no fixed plan, no clear objective, just continuous construction. Daniel got out of the car and observed the main facade. The surrounding silence was heavy, broken only by the wind that creaked some of the old structures. The place was now a tourist attraction, marketed as the most haunted house in the United States. Guides repeated stories of vengeful spirits and seances held at midnight, but Daniel wasn't there to feed legends. He was investigating something more concrete. Newly discovered documents that linked the construction of the mansion to a network of secret payments, hidden contracts, and unexplained financial transactions. As he walked toward the entrance, he realized that the atmosphere itself seemed to reject him. The air had a metallic, ancient smell, almost like aged gunpowder. Each step echoed strangely, as if the house absorbed the sound before returning it distorted. It wasn't fear, at least not yet, but an unsettling feeling that this place held something deliberately hidden. The antagonist in this story had no defined face. It wasn't a spirit, nor a supernatural entity. It was an entire system sustained by deaths, bought silences, and carefully crafted narratives. The Winchester fortune had not only financed weapons, but had also bought versions of the truth. Sarah had been transformed into an almost folkloric figure, the crazed widow who built to appease ghosts. This convenient version prevented any deeper investigation into the true destination of that money. Daniel entered the mansion, accompanied only by the creaking of the wood beneath his feet. Corridors stretched at impossible angles, doors opened onto emptiness, and staircases ended abruptly before solid walls. Nothing there seemed designed to be functional. Everything seemed designed to confuse, delay, and tire. It was as if the physical space itself were a trap designed for anyone who tried to understand too much. He pulled an old notebook from his backpack, a copy of Sarah Winchester's personal notes, obtained after months of negotiation with a private collector. The pages didn't contain spiritual delusions, as the tour guides claimed. They spoke of numbers, deadlines, erased names, and indirect references to voices, which Daniel interpreted not as ghosts, but as external pressures, lawyers, investors, politicians. As he made his way through the corridors, he began to understand that the mansion was not a plea for forgiveness, but a mechanism, a labyrinth created to consume money, justify endless expenses, and maintain financial flows invisible to the eyes of the public and the government. Each erected wall concealed something beyond wood and nails. At the back of the house, a locked door stood out because it wasn't on any tourist maps. The lock was old, but clearly reinforced. Daniel touched the cold surface of the wood and felt an involuntary shiver. It wasn't superstition, it was instinct. Something there wasn't meant to be found. The Winchester fortune had not only been accompanied by a curse, it had created one. And that house, more than a symbol of madness, seemed to be the vault where the truth had been buried alive. During the day, the Winchester mansion was traversed by groups of tourists guided by predictable itineraries. At night, however, the place took on a different function. Daniel quickly realized this when analyzing security records obtained from a third-party employee. There were areas of the house systematically excluded from visits, sectors classified as unstable or under restoration, even though no real work had taken place there in recent years. The isolation wasn't architectural, it was intentional. San Jose had grown up around the mansion, as if avoiding touching it directly. The modern city, with its tech companies and wide avenues, contrasted violently with that misshapen Victorian structure, stuck in a time that refused to pass. Daniel noticed that long-time residents still avoided the block. They didn't talk about ghosts, but about old news, a vague expression used by those who had learned not to ask too many questions. Sarah Winchester was beginning to emerge, for Daniel, as a figure very different from the popular caricature. The documents revealed a methodical woman, obsessed with control and deeply aware of the financial impact of every decision. After inheriting the fortune, she held frequent meetings with lawyers specializing in asset protection, something unusual for the time. The money didn't just flow in, it disappeared in carefully structured layers. Among the secondary characters, one name was repeated insistently: Arthur Bellamy, a civil engineer officially hired to solve structural problems. Bellamy appeared on payrolls for over 20 years, despite there being no public records of his professional activity outside the mansion. Old photographs always showed him distant, partially out of focus, as if avoiding being fully documented. He wasn't just a technician. He seemed to be the guardian of something that needed to remain invisible. Another key character was Eleanor Price, Sarah's personal secretary for the last 15 years of her life. Unlike other employees, Eleanor had received an unusual lifetime pension after her employer's death. Daniel located descendants who were still receiving payments linked to an old fund, created even before the building reached half its final size. There was no clear justification for this continued financial support. Daily life inside the mansion, according to conflicting accounts, followed its own logic. Workers did not receive complete instructions. Each team worked only in its designated area without knowing the overall project. Materials were discarded intact and replaced with identical ones. Staircases were dismantled after days of work. Doors were sealed without explanation. This fragmentation was not the result of confusion, but a deliberate strategy to prevent any complete overview of the whole. Culturally, the period in which the mansion was built coincided with a United States marked by territorial expansion, armed violence, and accelerated industrial growth. The Winchester rifle was not just a weapon, it was a symbol of the westward advance, of imposition by force, and of the normalization of death as a tool of progress. Sarah, living at the epicenter of this heritage, seemed to understand that fortune could not simply exist without a hidden cost. Daniel realized that the house reflected this same principle. There was no center, there was no symmetry, everything was excess and waste, a silent monument to the inability to morally organize what had been conquered with blood. Yet nothing indicated genuine remorse, only restraint. The antagonists were beginning to take shape more clearly. It wasn't just the Winchester family, but a network that included local politicians, West Coast banks, and investors who profited from perpetuating the mad widow narrative. While the public was distracted by ghost stories, contracts were signed, taxes were evaded and fortunes were redistributed. Daniel cross-referenced information from Sarah's diaries and public records and found disturbing patterns. Whenever a federal investigation threatened to get closer to the source of the fortune, construction accelerated. More spending, more noise, more distraction. The mansion functioned as both a physical and symbolic curtain. As he walked down a narrow hallway, lit only by a stained glass window, Daniel had the unsettling feeling that every character connected to that house had played a conscious role in something bigger. There were no absolute innocents there, only different levels of participation and silence. The mansion wasn't a refuge against ghosts, it was a collective mechanism for burying responsibilities, brick by brick. Daniel spent his third night inside the mansion without notifying the administration. He took advantage of a recurring malfunction in the alarm system, curiously always between 2 and 3 in the morning, to access areas outside the tourist circuit. The conflict, until then theoretical and documentary, was beginning to demand practical decisions. He was no longer just interpreting old files, he was interfering with something that had remained untouched for over a century. Inside the house, the atmosphere changed. The walls ceased to display Victorian ornamentation and took on a more raw, functional aspect. Exposed nails, unfinished wood, marks of repeated demolitions. This was not the work of an eccentric heiress trying to please spirits, but a continuous process of adaptation, as if the house needed to respond to invisible external pressures. The first concrete obstacle arose when Daniel found a completely sealed room behind a false staircase. It wasn't listed in any known architectural records. The door was covered by panels, and access was only possible by removing part of the structure, something that would require time and noise. He noted the location, discreetly photographed it, and retreated. For the first time since the beginning of the investigation, he felt he was being watched. Not by ghosts, but by real, living people who still had a direct interest in that silence. The next day, Daniel received an informal warning. An unsigned email, sent from a local server, suggested that he take advantage of the official story and not try to correct narratives that have worked well for decades. There was no explicit threat, but the tone was clear. Someone knew he was there, and someone had access to the mansion's routines. This contact marked a decisive shift in the conflict. The investigation ceased to be merely retrospective and began to interfere with still active interests. Daniel cross-referenced recent financial data and discovered that funds linked to the historical preservation of the mansion were being used as intermediaries for capital movements. The house still served its original purpose, to absorb money, justify expenses, and obliterate traces. Secondary characters began to gain real weight in the conflict. Eleanor Price, previously seen only as a loyal secretary, now emerged as a silent financial operator. Bank records indicated that she had brokered political donations in the 1920s and 1930s, always using the Winchester name as a philanthropic front. Her public image as a dedicated employee concealed an active role in maintaining the scheme. Arthur Bellamy, the engineer, proved to be even more central. Daniel found indirect references to him in correspondence between California banks and New York law firms. Bellamy not only supervised construction work, he validated technical reports that justified non-existent emergency repairs. Each report was an authorization for new flows of money. The conflict intensified because Daniel needed to decide how far to go without completely exposing himself. Publishing partial information could alert those involved and close doors. Waiting too long, on the other hand, meant risking the loss of physical evidence. The mansion was in constant maintenance, a convenient euphemism for strategic space alterations. During a guided tour, Daniel observed a revealing detail. A group of tourists was deliberately led along a longer route after an employee received a message on the radio. That simple change of route confirmed his suspicions. The internal flow was still being controlled in real time. The house continued to be used as an instrument for managing attention. Daniel's emotional conflict was also transforming. He had begun the investigation seeking to dismantle a historical myth. Now he realized he was dealing with a system that had survived generations, precisely because of its ability to seem too absurd to be taken seriously. The legend of the curse served as a shield. Anyone who questioned it was easily dismissed as sensationalist or paranoid. Tension rose when one of the photographs taken by Daniel disappeared from his camera without a plausible technical explanation. Other images remained intact. Only that one, depicting the sealed room, was missing. It wasn't a memory lapse or random file corruption. It was selective interference. Someone had gained remote access to the device or the automatic backup. The central conflict became clear. Revealing the truth meant confronting not only a historical legacy, but a contemporary structure that still profited from distortion. Each of Daniel's steps provoked a silent, careful reaction, calculated to avoid drawing public attention. The mansion reacted not like a supernatural organism, but like a human defense system. Corridors closed, access was denied, information vanished. People appeared only to remind everyone that the place still had owners, even if their names weren't on any plaque. Daniel was no longer investigating a closed case. He had entered an ongoing conflict. As the main conflict intensified, unexpected ramifications began to emerge, revealing that the mansion was not the only element in a larger mechanism. Daniel began to divide his attention between historical investigation and contemporary movements that, at first glance, seemed disconnected, but soon proved to be pieces of the same puzzle. One of the most unsettling subplots emerged from a small court file from 1906, the year of the Great San Francisco earthquake. Officially, part of the mansion was damaged and isolated after the disaster. Unofficially, Daniel discovered that this event had served as justification for the disappearance of entire documents related to the Winchester inheritance. Parallel wills, stock records, and assignment agreements simply ceased to exist under the pretext of post-earthquake chaos. The destruction wasn't just physical, it was selective. This historical subplot connected directly to the present when Daniel identified an investment fund created decades later, whose name indirectly referenced the 1906 disaster. The fund was still operating discreetly, financing real estate projects in California. Part of the initial capital came from untraceable private donations, a legal category created precisely after the earthquake to facilitate rapid reconstruction. The past had provided the legal loophole. The present was exploiting it. Another layer of complexity involved the very preservation of the mansion. Daniel discovered that historical preservation associations were constantly fighting to maintain its unstable structure status. This guaranteed continued federal subsidies and prevented more thorough audits. The subplot here wasn't just financial, but political. The house needed to appear perpetually incomplete to continue functioning as an administrative justification. On a personal level, Daniel began to face direct consequences. A former colleague from the newsroom, Marcus Reed, who helped him verify documents, abruptly stopped collaborating. There was no discussion, just a sudden silence, followed by a short message: "This isn't worth the price." The human subplot of fear was beginning to take hold. People around Daniel perceived risks that he still insisted on facing. Time pressure kicked in when Daniel received confirmation that a new restoration was scheduled for the following month. Large-scale work involving the removal of interior walls and the replacement of old structures. Any remaining physical evidence could be destroyed under the guise of safety. Time ceased to be a neutral resource and began to act as a silent antagonist. Among the current staff at the mansion, a secondary figure gained prominence: Linda Morales, The maintenance supervisor. Unlike other employees, Linda showed visible discomfort when dealing with certain areas of the house. In brief conversations, she avoided names, changed the subject, and repeated procedures as if ordered. Her subplot wasn't one of active conspiracy, but of forced complicity. She knew that forbidden zones existed not because of structural instability, but because of orders from above. The subplots intertwined as Daniel realized that each one reinforced the other. The earthquake justified legal loopholes. The legal loopholes supported modern funds. The funds financed the eternal maintenance of the mansion. The mansion, in turn, continued to fuel the legend of the curse, keeping the audience distracted. The greatest complexity lay in the fact that none of this required visible central coordination. The system functioned by inertia. People inherited functions, not truths. They fulfilled roles without necessarily understanding the whole picture. Silence was passed on as part of the job. With the date of the restoration approaching, Daniel felt the true weight of the urgency. He needed to choose which subplots to delve into and which to abandon. Each decision meant losing something: time, allies, evidence, or personal safety. The investigation ceased to be merely a search for historical truth and became an exercise in intellectual and physical survival. All the subplots pointed to the same unsettling conclusion. The mansion was not a prolonged mistake, but a solution too ingenious to be dismantled without resistance. The turning point didn't come with a spectacular discovery, but with a simple and devastating realization. Daniel realized he had been looking in the wrong place. For weeks, he had tried to access sealed rooms, lost files, and deleted records. The answer, however, lay not in what had been hidden, but in what had remained visible all along, repeated, ignored, trivialized. Everything converged on a single element: continuous construction. By reviewing old timelines alongside financial statements, Daniel noticed an inescapable pattern. Each major construction cycle coincided not with personal events in Sarah Winchester's life, as popular narrative insisted, but with specific legal milestones: changes in tax laws, federal investigations into arms companies, banking crises, and regulatory reforms. The mansion reacted to the state. It was a direct response to institutional risk. This realization completely altered the direction of the investigation. The house was not a reflection of Sarah's guilt, but a deliberate instrument of financial engineering, a living, adaptable project designed to consume capital at a variable rate, creating justifiable losses and shifting resources without raising suspicion. The curse was, in fact, a carefully sustained performance. The unexpected event occurred when Daniel gained access to a partial copy of a contract signed in 1887 between Sarah Winchester and a Chicago-based legal financial consortium. The document, written in technical and evasive language, described the mansion as a continuous property absorption structure. There was no mention of spirits, mediumship, or fear, only clauses regarding uninterrupted construction, the absence of a final design, and total operational autonomy. The central revelation was brutal. Sarah Winchester wasn't building to appease the dead, but to protect the living, heirs, investors, and political allies. The house functioned as a legal sink for a morally indefensible fortune. Every useless staircase, every false door, every unnecessary demolition was part of a method. The emotional reactions arose not as dramatic shock, but as a silent reconfiguration. Daniel felt the weight of lucidity. He wasn't uncovering an individual madness, but exposing a historical precedent. If it had worked once, it could have been replicated countless other times, in other contexts, with other distracting narratives. The antagonist, previously vague, took on clearer contours. It wasn't Sarah Winchester. It was the invisible consortium that had transformed public guilt into private gain, a system that perfectly understood the value of irrationality as a smokescreen. The legend of the haunted widow had been a convenient byproduct, not the cause. The definitive turning point occurred when Daniel cross-referenced the contract with a clause still active in modern funds. The same legal language, almost identical, appeared in contemporary financial structures linked to historical preservation. The mechanism had not only survived, it had been updated. At that moment, Daniel understood that publishing a traditional article wouldn't be enough. The revelation couldn't be presented as a mere historical curiosity. It implied legal, institutional, and moral responsibility on a much larger scale. He wasn't just challenging a myth, he was threatening a silent model of asset concealment. The internal conflict dissolved. Only one operational choice remained: to go through with it and accept the consequences, or to allow the story to remain comfortable, absurd, and profitable. The mansion, motionless and silent in the background, ceased to seem like a human error. It became, with disturbing clarity, a work of social engineering disguised as madness. The revelation didn't produce an immediate explosion. There were no direct confrontations, nor explicit threats. The consequences came more insidiously, spreading like silent cracks in an ancient structure. From the moment Daniel understood the true function of the mansion, every movement around him took on a different weight. The first reaction came from the system, not from the people. Daniel's access to certain digital files was blocked without prior notice. Public databases began requiring additional authentication. Requests that previously took days to process started getting lost in endless administrative queues. Nothing was denied directly. Everything was delayed. The mechanism he had identified was now working against him. Within the mansion, the changes were subtle, yet revealing. Areas that were once merely restricted became completely inaccessible. Hazard signs appeared overnight. The maintenance supervisors took on new faces, all excessively correct, excessively attentive. Daniel realized that his every move was being monitored, not to openly stop him, but to anticipate it. The relationships between the characters also changed. Linda Morales began to avoid any direct contact. When they crossed paths in the hallways, she kept her eyes downcast and quickened her pace. Her reaction was not one of guilt, but of self-preservation. She understood that the system didn't need conscious conspirators, only people willing to continue working. Daniel tried to share some of his findings with an editor in New York. The response was cautious, almost clinical. The story was interesting but difficult to support legally. The subtext was clear. Nobody wanted to be the first to confront something that seemed too solid to dismantle without collateral damage. Internally, Daniel didn't allow himself much reflection. The practical consequences demanded constant adaptation. He began duplicating backups, fragmenting information, and working with redundancies. Each action generated an equivalent reaction from the system. The more he moved, the more the structure reorganized itself to absorb the impact. The mansion, in this context, continued to function as it always had. Tourists circulated, took photos, laughed nervously in front of false doors. Guides repeated stories of mediums and restless spirits. The legend remained intact, now perceived by Daniel as a calculated noise, a carefully preserved distraction. The most disturbing consequences came from the realization that nothing there depended on original intentions anymore. Sarah Winchester had been dead for decades. Bellamy, Eleanor, and the system's first operators had also been dead. Yet the mechanism persisted, reproduced by inherited contracts, positions, and procedures. The system survived because no one had a real interest in questioning it deeply. Daniel felt the isolation solidify, not due to emotional abandonment, but due to structural incompatibility. His presence was beginning to generate too much friction. He was no longer a curious or eccentric researcher. He had become an inconvenient variable. The ultimate consequence of this stage was clear. The conflict had gone beyond the level of discovery. Now it was a matter of resistance. The system didn't need to eliminate it. It only needed to tire it out, delay it, dilute it, just as it had done with the original fortune. The mansion didn't react with violence. It reacted efficiently. The system's resistance forced Daniel to change. There wasn't a single moment of heroic decision, nor an emotional outburst. Overcoming it came as a gradual, almost technical adjustment in the way he thought and acted. The journalist who had arrived in California, believing in direct exposure, now understood that he was facing something that couldn't be fought with light, but with precision. The first sign of growth was the relinquishment of total control. Daniel stopped trying to gather all the evidence into a single, coherent dossier. Instead, he began to deliberately fragment the information, spreading it in independent layers. A financial file here, a historical contract there, an anonymous legal analysis sent to a retired university professor. No single piece, in isolation, was explosive. Together, they became inescapable. He also abandoned the idea of being the protagonist. He didn't sign preliminary articles. He didn't seek interviews. He began to operate as an invisible intermediary, someone who connected the dots without claiming authorship. This change in behavior wasn't cowardice. It was adaptation. The system survived because it identified central targets. Daniel ceased to be one. At the mansion, his demeanor changed noticeably. He no longer tried to access restricted areas or confront employees. He moved around like an ordinary visitor, attentive to seemingly irrelevant details, shift change times, maintenance sequences, and minor inconsistencies between words and procedures. His growth lay in learning to observe without provoking an immediate reaction. New challenges arose, but they were qualitatively different. They didn't involve direct blockages, but rather ambiguities, incomplete information, sources that spoke only in metaphors, documents that confirmed patterns without ever explicitly stating them. Daniel needed to develop a new skill, working with the unspoken, with what was discreetly repeated in multiple contexts. The arc of personal transformation became visible in his choices. Before, he would insist on irrefutable proof and definitive conclusions. Now he accepted building a field of converging evidence. Truth would not appear as confession, but as an impossibility of denial over time. A crucial shift occurred when Daniel decided to involve academic institutions, not with accusations, but with questions. Studies on historical preservation as a financial instrument. Comparative analyses between large-scale ongoing projects and cycles of economic regulation. By shifting the debate to the theoretical field, he removed the system from the comfort of administrative silence. Internally, growth manifested itself in the absence of anxiety. Daniel no longer measured success by immediate results. He understood that he was working against something built to last for generations. His role was not to single-handedly dismantle the structure, but to initiate a persistent instability. The system reacted less, not because it had won, but because it had ceased to identify a direct confrontation. This reduction in friction confirmed that the change in strategy was working. The mansion continued to be maintained, renovated, and displayed. But now, in parallel, academic articles, discrete debates, and legal questions emerged that, although not explicitly mentioning Winchester, pointed to the same model. Daniel had grown to understand that overcoming in that context did not mean defeating the antagonist, but surviving him without being absorbed. His transformation was not visible in fiery speeches, but in silent and sustainable choices. The research ceased to be a race against time and became a process of controlled erosion. With the terrain slowly shifting, Daniel focused on closing open loops. The subplots that had previously accumulated now needed to converge, not out of narrative haste, but because the system was beginning to move again. The grand restoration of the mansion, previously announced, had been discreetly brought forward. Machines arrived at irregular hours. Third-party teams appeared without clear identification. Something was being accelerated. Daniel understood that this movement was not routine. It was containment. If the structure had begun to generate external questions, the natural response would be to reinforce the spectacle. More construction, more justifications, more noise. The system was preparing for a preventive closing of loopholes. He then decided to resolve what was still pending. The subplot of the 1887 contract was sent to 3 distinct specialists in different countries, without a common context. They all arrived at the same technical conclusion. The language used described in a deliberately abstract way a mechanism of continuous asset drain. The independent convergence of these analyses provided something that Daniel did not yet have: external validation. The Eleanor Price subplot also found a practical resolution. A university researcher, cross-referencing the records linked to her name, published an article on intergenerational historical records and ethical opacity. He didn't mention Eleanor or Winchester, but the model was exposed. The system was gradually losing its narrative exclusivity. Daniel also resolved the most sensitive issue, the sealed room. He understood that he didn't need to physically access it. The true value of that space lay in the fact that it existed and wasn't officially recorded. By mapping all known floor plans and demonstrating with mathematical precision the volumetric incompatibility of the structure, he produced irrefutable proof of architectural concealment. Something was there. What it was no longer mattered so much. Tension was mounting because time was running out. The restoration was progressing too quickly. Walls were being removed, corridors altered. The house was being reconfigured to eliminate old redundancies. Daniel knew the system was updating itself, as it always had in the face of regulatory threats. He made his final decision pragmatically. He prepared a dossier that was distributed not as an indictment, but as a compilation of technical, historical, and financial inconsistencies. Each part was sent to a different destination: a university, an international newsroom, an independent legal group, a public digital archive. None of them alone told the whole story. The build-up to the climax didn't involve direct confrontation. It involved inevitability. Daniel wasn't seeking to expose a specific villain, but to create a scenario in which the official narrative could no longer stand without profound revision. At the mansion, the atmosphere had changed. There was no visible hostility, but there was a sense of urgency. Staff followed strict protocols. Visitors were handled with even greater care. The house, once a symbol of disorder, now operated with almost military efficiency. The climax was approaching not as an explosion, but as saturation. Too much information, too many questions, patterns too clear to be dismissed as coincidence or legend. Daniel observed the mansion one last time before leaving California. It remained imposing, absurd, labyrinthine, but it no longer seemed untouchable. The structure was ready to be tested, not by force, but by the distributed truth. The climax didn't happen inside the mansion, nor in front of cameras, nor in a courtroom. It occurred diffusely, almost silently, when the system was forced to respond to multiple pressures at the same time, something it was never designed for. The first impact came from academia. A symposium on historic preservation and structural finance held in Chicago presented 3 distinct studies that, without apparent coordination, described the same phenomenon: continuous constructions used as mechanisms for absorbing capital from ethically compromised sources. The implicit historical example was unmistakable. For the first time, the narrative ceased to be folkloric and became technical. Days later, a European news outlet published an extensive report on the architecture of distraction. The text didn't mention the Winchester mansion in the title, but dedicated an entire section to late 19th century California, methodically dismantling the myth of the Mad Widow. The effect was immediate. Other media outlets began to revisit the story, not as a haunted legend, but as a convenient, symbolic construct. The system reacted as it always had, trying to accelerate construction, reinforce tourist narratives, and reaffirm the traditional version. But this time, there was a new problem. The questions didn't come from a single source. There was no central author to discredit. Each attempt at an answer generated new documentary inconsistencies. The turning point came when an independent auditor, analyzing historical preservation funds, published a preliminary report pointing to atypical asset structures with poorly documented historical origins. The report did not directly accuse anyone of crimes, but recommended a complete review of old financial chains. That was enough. The protagonist's transformation became visible at that moment. Daniel did not intervene, he did not give interviews, he did not claim authorship. He observed the domino effect he had helped to initiate and resisted the temptation to centralize the narrative. His growth lay precisely in the absence of protagonism. He had ceased to be a solitary investigator and had become a catalyst. The surprising twist came from within the mansion itself. During one of the emergency renovations, engineers discovered a structural discrepancy that was impossible to ignore. An unregistered architectural void, too large to be a miscalculation. The work was halted. Municipal authorities demanded formal explanations. For the first time in over a century, the house was treated not as a historical eccentricity, but as a real technical problem. The official explanation failed. The plans didn't match. The records contradicted each other. The silence, once effective, became suspicious. The myth began to crumble, not through denial, but through an excess of reality. At the height of the climax, the mansion was temporarily closed to the public, not because of ghosts. For an audit, the central conflict was resolved there. The truth did not emerge as a dramatic confession, but as a collapse of narrative support. The legend of the curse lost its protective function. Without it, only an absurd structure remained, demanding rational explanations, precisely what had always been avoided. Daniel watched the news in a hotel room far from California. He didn't feel triumph. He felt something rarer, coherence. The system, exposed to the diffuse light of multiple perspectives, was finally reacting in a disordered way. The mansion still stood, but for the first time, it no longer controlled the story that was told about it. The interruption of activities at the Winchester mansion did not cause an immediate scandal, nor did it lead to arrests or public confessions. What occurred was deeper and, for many involved, more disturbing: the need to explain. For decades, the house had existed protected by the irrationality that surrounded it. Without the myth of the curse, every useless corridor now required technical justification, every expense needed documentary support, every renovation needed to make sense. The final consequences began to manifest themselves in layers. Historical preservation funds were temporarily frozen while audits reviewed origins and flows. Institutions that previously treated the mansion as a cultural curiosity began to classify it as a problematic case of heritage management. The change in language was subtle, but decisive. Where there had once been folklore, there was now administrative responsibility. The characters who operated on the fringes of the system disappeared from the public scene. Councils were dissolved. Contracts were terminated without detailed explanations. No specific culprit was identified, but the network that sustained the silence began to unravel due to loss of viability. The model had ceased to be secure. Daniel, for his part, did not publish a major signed report. His role became diluted in the process, exactly as planned. His name appeared only in academic footnotes, generic acknowledgements, and cross-references. The conclusion of his journey was not recognition, but permanence. He continued working, now with a more mature understanding of the limits and possibilities of truth. The mansion remained as a physical structure, but it lost its original symbolic function. Visitors would still return, but with a different perspective, no longer in search of ghosts, but rather uncomfortable answers about how society chooses to hide its most violent origins behind convenient narratives. In the long term, the impact was silent, yet lasting. Studies began to cite the Winchester model as an example of how architecture, myth, and bureaucracy can combine to dilute historical accountability. Not as an urban legend, but as a warning. The protagonist's journey concluded without explicit catharsis, but with ethical coherence. Daniel hadn't defeated a villain, because the antagonist had never been a person. It was a collective habit, that of accepting absurd stories to avoid difficult questions. The curse of the Winchester fortune wasn't in the dead who supposedly roamed the house, but in the ingenuity with which the living had learned to normalize the silence. Years later, the Winchester mansion remained open to the public, but it was no longer presented as a haunted house. The guided tours spoke of excess, of social fear, of wealth built on industrial violence. The hallways were still cluttered. The useless staircases remained in place, but the nervous laughter of tourists had been replaced by attentive silence. In a Midwestern university library, a student was consulting an old article and found, in a discreet note, a cross-reference Winchester model. See also Heritage Concealment Architecture. The name no longer evoked ghosts. Somewhere, Daniel watched from a distance, without intervening. The story hadn't ended, only shifted. Like all surviving truths, it now belonged to whoever was willing to look at it without discomfort. Stories like that of the Winchester fortune survive not only because of mystery, but because we choose versions that reassure us. Ghosts are easier to accept than systems. Individual madness is more comfortable than collective responsibility. As you finish reading this story, reflect on how many other well-known stories may conceal similar mechanisms. How many popular myths serve to deflect uncomfortable questions? How many structures remain untouched because they seem too absurd to be taken seriously? Share this story not for entertainment, but as a provocation. Question pre-established narratives. Observe what is repeated, what is never explained, what has always been treated as legend. Because, often, the real curse lies not in what haunts us at night, but in what we accept without question, in broad daylight.